See, I'm seeing that she's not signed on yet. She is in the Zoom system as the.
All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the last and final masterclass session. We're so excited to go out with the big bang. The series has been about systems thinking, especially looking at measurement and evaluation. So this session is a bit unique, where we want to know where to go from here and what does taking a systems leadership approach look like. So this will be a little bit different than all the other sessions, but we're so excited. So let us begin. Let me just quickly screen share. All right. So today is the last day. Please continue in the chat to share your name, your country, organization, why are you here, what you hope to learn, and whatever else you want to share with us. My name is Shek Rafay. I'm the Global Technical Lead with the Early Childhood Development Action Network. And we're on the final day of our masterclass series. We are on theme 7. This series has been co-curated with Meg Hargreaves at NORC and EGDAN. It's part of our broader systems thinking for early childhood development initiative in collaboration with Harvard University and the support of Porticus. We have 4 pillars to the work we do. We do systems research, systems investing, systems measurement, and systems design and implementation. And this series is part of system measurement to explore and learn about systems measurement. Although right now we're going to talk about systems leadership, which is really exciting. As always, this is the first time we are giving you an opportunity to earn a certificate. You have until May 17th to at least complete 50% of the sessions and complete the short survey that's been shared, and that's also available on the website. After the session, of course, you can access everything, the recordings, presentations, resources on the website, and continue on the conversation at ECD Connect. As always, we will begin with welcome and introductions, the masterclass session, the dialogue with the early childhood expert, and a participant Q&A. So just a few things. Please make sure you put your questions in the Q&A box so we don't miss them. The chat is a busy place. And if you want to chat, make sure the default setting is hosts and panelists. So just select everyone so everyone can see your message. And oh my God, I cannot tell you, Mitzi has been translating every single session for us. Huge thank you to UNICEF Lacro for sponsoring the Spanish translation. This is what partnership looks like. Thank you again, UNICEF Lacro. All right, colleagues, we are session number 14. So I am going to introduce you to our incredible panel today. We are going to explore systems leadership. So today we have our first expert with us, David Navarro. He's the strategic director of the Swiss-based social enterprise 4SD, which stands for Skills, Systems, and Synergies for Sustainable Development. And the Institute trains and mentors leaders for sustainable development. Through his expansive career, he has worked in executive roles with the UK Department of International Development, the UK Government Foreign Office, and various agencies within the UN system, including the WHO. His work has focused on food systems, nutrition and health, as well as nature-based solutions and climate action. He has curated the Food Systems Dialogue, involving more than 1,700 leaders in 29 locations, and contributed to preparations for the UN September 2019 Climate Action Summit. Along with him, we have John Atkinson, who is our Systems Leadership and Transformational Change Advisor. He's a designer, architect, and catalyst for whole systems change, and has been at the forefront of developing understanding of working with organizations as living systems for over 25 years. He has worked across climate, health, and food systems, and is one of the leading practitioners in public service leadership development in the United Kingdom. He curates www.theheartoftheart.org, described as the best online resource for systems change. John has also published The Art of Changemaking for University Leadership Programs, and is a regular contributor to systems leadership-related topics in the sector press and on national platforms. And finally, with them, we'll have our early childhood expert and discussant, Elizabeth Lule, our very own executive director of EGDAN. And she's a widely recognized expert in international development and global health issues, and has devoted her career to strengthening global commitments and programs addressing the needs of women, adolescents, children, and infants. She's been instrumental in establishing and supporting global partnerships, networks, and coalitions to improve reproductive, maternal, newborn, child, and adolescent health and HIV programs, and was the founding chair of the Reproductive Health Supplies Coalition. And on a personal note, I just want to say that my own systems journey has started with these three people right here, and I consider them my own personal systems mentors, without whom none of us would be here today, none of this would be happening. So it's such an honor to have, to have this opportunity to close off this series is really a milestone for the platform and all of us today. So thank you so much, John, David, Elizabeth, for agreeing to be a part of this. I'm so excited about the next hour together with you. So over to you.
Well, Shekafe, thank you. What a beautiful introduction. Amazing to see so many different people, so many different places, so many different backgrounds coming together. Shekafe, your energy and drive in getting these sessions to happen, and the enthusiasm and love and care that you bring to them is superb. So thank you. I'm really excited about what we're going to be doing, the three of us, with you for the next sort of hour and a bit. We're going to cover why complex problems are different to complicated problems, and why systems leadership helps when you're addressing the complex ones. We're going to find how, when you're working with systems that are changing rapidly, we need to be ready to step across a threshold to advance onto a different trajectory. And that means leading in ways that encourage something called emergence. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'll cover those two elements. I'll then hand over to David, who is probably the foremost exponent of doing this for real in really big, messy environments. So David will look at how dialogue processes applied to food systems and their transformation enable stakeholders to collaborate in fostering emergence and stepping across that threshold, and what we've learned about the leadership qualities and ways of leading that are necessary if such approaches are going to work. And then with Elizabeth, we'll explore that a little bit further and open it up at that point to the questions that you've been putting into the Q&A. So that's a little bit of what's in store over the period ahead. We'll talk to a couple of slides to begin with, just to frame the conversation. So there we go. We've called it stepping across a threshold. A threshold's a rather funny English word at times. It means almost the formal demarcation between one area and another. You step across the threshold into a new house, or you step across a threshold from one country into another. So stepping across the threshold is symbolically important. And this is what systems leadership gives us. It gives us this opportunity to step into an altogether different level of performance. And for us, that comes when you start to look at the way humans work as ecosystems rather than as some great big delivery machine. So if we go to the next slide, the way that we think about, that's it, we've got next slide. The way we think about the way human systems work often looks something like this. If you talk to someone, particularly people who lead organizations, in the old days, they used to have a sheet of paper with these sorts of boxes on their pin board behind them, and bring it down and say, this is how it all works around here. And what we notice about this hierarchical organizational chart, if you like, is people are really quite critical of it, but it does do something really, really well. It helps solve what we call complicated problems. Now, a complicated problem might be really, really tricky. It might be really difficult, but somebody somewhere knows how to do it. And if they're in your organization, you ask them and you get them to lead the piece of work that's needed. If it's too expensive a resource, maybe you have to contract it in. Maybe you have to get someone to come and help you for a little. But for a complicated problem, there is a known answer somewhere, and when it's done, it's done. So I'll give you an example of that. If you want to fire a stone from a great big catapult, one of those things that they used to use in the old days to attack castles and things like that, you can calculate the weight of the stone. You can calculate the springiness of the wood and its elastic coefficient. You can calculate the air resistance. You know that a stone will fly in a parabola. You can even take into account the rotation of the earth if the stone is going to be in the air a long time. And if you're really good at all of that sort of stuff, if you're some kind of ballistics engineer, you can figure out exactly where that stone should land. And that's a complicated problem. And what this way of organizing does, by separating problems into bits, is it builds specialism, and it builds people in each of those little boxes who are really, really good at what they do. And we should value that. It's given us so much in the world. At the same time, if you want to move on to the next slide, David, at the same time, human organization naturally doesn't look like lots of little boxes joined by nice, neat lines between them with everything separated. Human organization works like an ecosystem, a living system, where everything is interconnected. And if you touch one element of it, then everything else is somehow at some point affected. So the diagram here, it's actually a map of the internet in the quite early days of the internet, but it could be any networked organization like this. If you imagine it's a map of a health system, the big green splodge with lots of things connected to it at the top there in the middle might be a hospital with a big centralized process of things going on. And the yellow might be primary care, and the red might be community care, and the purple might be social care, and they all interconnect through different people in different ways. And so changing one bit can have profound implications for another, but it may not happen until some length of time. If I change something in the green, it may change something in one of those other little bits of green at the bottom, which touches something in the red, which touches something in the yellow, and then the whole thing starts to reorder. So what we notice when we work with ecosystems is that cause and effect can be disconnected in both time. It could happen the thing that happens could happen much, much later, and it disconnected in space. We might see things happening in one place, which we struggle to attribute to changes that took place in another. Small changes in starting conditions can provoke profound changes in outcome. One of the things about the previous way of looking, that hierarchical chart, is if we fix one thing there, we can run the same process over and over and over again and expect it to work. In a mechanical system, that's true. In a human system, clearly that doesn't work the same way. So we need a different way of thinking about it that deals with this sort of environment. And this sort of environment is a complex environment. This is where systems leadership comes in. So if we go back to our catapult, where we calculated where we could fire that rock and it would land, if you change the rock for a bird, what happens? You fire the bird into the sky? Well, probably it goes to where it normally goes, where it goes to sleep, where it goes to eat, but you don't necessarily know that. It can be distracted, it can go in all sorts of ways. So we're dealing with a problem where the nice deterministic linear effect starts to go. We're dealing with a living system, and that's the reality of what, looking at the things that you've all described in the chat as to the work you do and where you come from, that's the reality of everyday life. We can't just solve neat defined puzzles all the time. We have to deal with complex challenges that have multiple interconnections, multiple interests, and multiple perspectives on what might be best done. So if we go to the next slide, please. What we're looking for is what we call living systems leadership. And for us, that's a sort of leadership that can take account of this interaction between action and consequences. There are always unintended consequences of our actions in a living system. They may be predictable or they may not. They may be beneficial or they may not. But there are always things that you didn't expect because you can never map everything all the way through. Establishing links of causality is often impossible. And when we try to impose the sort of management techniques that we use on that hierarchical organizational chart onto a big human system, they can often cause as many problems as they fix. We try and define, for example, an outcome that we want to achieve that is blind to many other things that may be going on. So the leadership act in a living system is about balance. How do we find a way of maintaining an equilibrium that helps us continually adapt to what's happening around us for the health of the system that we're working with? Can we go on to the next one, Dave? So most of the time when we're working on things, we're working along what I've caused on here the red line. We're probably continuing to get better at what we do. We're probably continuing to make improvement, But if the world outside of us is changing exponentially, and this was something David could maybe say more about with COVID, where the infection curve is an exponential curve, a linear response isn't going to hit it. We have to find a way to step across that threshold onto a more exponential way of working. And so this is one of the key acts of systems leadership. How do we move onto a way of working where we can rapidly adapt to changes in the external environment by making sense of them and creating actions that people rapidly connect with and take on? So there is coherence across a system rather than control, where it all depends on one person thinking about it. This step, if it is transformational, is a step that is sometimes labeled emergence. This is where something new emerges that enables us to rapidly adapt to what's going on, because we're no longer constrained by the patterns of activity that keep us running on the red line. And for an emergence to happen, we need three things in place. The first of those is energy. If there's not sufficient energy for what we want to do, then we're not going to make anything move. And as leaders, the skill in systems leadership is to say, well, how do I encourage, how do I provoke, how do I find the energy that others have for something to align together in order that we have sufficient drive to make something different happen. If it's all about my energy and how much effort I can put into running around trying to connect things up, trying to make things happen, the limit is me. And if we're going to really make this sort of change, I can't be the limit on what takes place. So it's energy. It needs enough energy to make this step. The next thing that systems leaders are doing is managing difference or dissonance. If we've all got energy for the thing we're already doing, we're just running that red line harder and harder and harder. And what we're really looking to do is to say, well, what's the thing we've missed? What's the step that if we could only make it changes everything? And that requires us to have some hard and difficult conversations, to think, why am I here? What is this person doing this? Why am I even in conversation with these people? They just don't get it. We've got to be able to sit in that space where people are genuinely disagreeing, but being honest about why they think what they think, being honest about what's driving them. And the act of systems leadership at this point is to say, well, how do I hold that all together? How do I stop people getting so frustrated with each other that they just leave and take themselves out of the process? How do I ensure that there is sufficient honesty that people are actually saying the things that matter? And that's why I spoke about systems leadership as being an act of balance. How do you hold all that together? How do you tune in to just how far can I let this go? Just how tight do I need to hold it? And then the third element of it, that's energy, dissonance. The third element of it is amplification. How do I get this being much bigger than me? How do I make it that I'm not the one that matters? Too many leadership models are all about me and what do I have to do? The act in systems leadership is to say, how do I find the capacity for rapid amplification that means it's not dependent on me, that others take this up and run with it? And in so doing, we lose a little bit of control, we lose a little bit of purity, but what we gain is an enormous reach and step forward. So stepping across that threshold is an act of emergence that requires energy, dissonance, and amplification. Let's do one more slide, David. The challenge is when we're sat on that red line, we're really at the bottom of this ladder you can see here. It's obscurity. The patterns of activity that are driving that red line's continued action, they may be funding patterns, they may be policy patterns, there may be patterns in the way that we educate. They're driving to us and we're not aware of them. We're just responding to them. We don't even know it's going on. And that most of the time is what's happening. And that's not a bad thing, because if we had to think through every single response with all the variation to every single entity, we'd be forever clogged up in our thinking. But when it's no longer helping us or no longer achieving what we do, it starts to limit. And the key out of it is firstly to see the patterns that we're in, to see the pattern that holds us on the red line. And when we do that, what emerges is a story about what's going on. We call it here its dominant narrative. It's the story we're all saying about this is how this works. And we're still captured by that. We may not like it. We may not like that funders, for example, choose to fund specific interventions and not long-term variation. But we can't see another alternative. And then the insight is noticing other alternative narratives. And the insight piece is almost invariably a move of expansion. In systems leadership, we're thinking very much about not what must I give up in order for this to happen, but what can I add to what I do that makes me more potent, more able to influence, more able to achieve the things that I want to do in the process. And that comes from noticing the alternative insights, the alternative narratives, the things other people say about what's going, not just pushing my story. And that then gives the opportunity to craft interventions that bring a different collection of people into the mix to rewire the relationships. And that's the point where emergence takes place. So that's a rapid run through, if you like, of some of the conditions that might sit behind systems leadership and how it works. There's much, much more to it than that. But this idea of being able to move from a red line, which is, okay, getting better, but not quick enough, onto a blue line that exponentially shifts us forward is really, really key. And in working with David, that's what I've noticed him do. I've seen that happen in a variety of settings. And I think at this point, what I'm going to do is hand over to David and say, well, okay, tell us a little bit about what that actually looks like, some of the things that you were doing, and if you get a chance, maybe some of the places or settings in which you were doing it. Because the first, I think, or one of the key elements for me is the dialogues that you referred to earlier. So, David?
Thank you very much, John. Do you know, everybody, I need to tell you a few stories. And the first one is about really how I met John and why. I was working in the office of the UN Secretary General. It was 2017. We'd just had the Sustainable Development Goals agreed in the UN General Assembly, and my responsibility, working for the UN Secretary General, was to try to mainstream the Sustainable Development Goals right across the UN system. And I realized that a whole series of new ways of thinking, working, and leading would be necessary to address these complex sustainable development goals that the member states had developed through negotiations in the working groups that were set up in the run-up to 2015. I contacted John because I needed to find people who could help me understand what kinds of new patterns of thoughts and working would be needed to deal with these complex challenges. John said to me, I can't really help you solve the problems that you're talking about, but I can help you look at them differently. And in 2017, I started to have the opportunity to listen to John and to understand that the new ways of thinking and working that we needed were really ways of thinking and working that reflect the properties of human systems, or what we've just described as living systems. What John did was to help me with some ideas for addressing these systems challenges in real life. I found it helpful, but it took me a long time to get comfortable with some of the ideas that he introduced. I found emergence a quite tricky concept to understand. And I found his ability to explain that we need to shift and sometimes to leap to move to a new state difficult to understand, but immensely important when in 2020 I was given responsibility for working with the Director General of the World Health Organization on COVID. It was with John that I met with Shekufe, I'd previously met Elizabeth in other settings, and I want to just say how immensely inspired and grateful I am to Shekufe, Elizabeth, and the rest of the team for arranging this masterclass and introducing so many of you to this way of thinking and working that has really changed my life. It came late in my life. I wish I'd had it earlier. I've been working with dialogue. I thought I'd just give you a bit of an essay here, but I hope it helps, and we'll of course make sure that you get these slides and the references afterwards. Bringing the Sustainable Development Agenda with its 17 goals to life presents really complex challenges for governments, NGOs, business, scientific and industrial organizations, because for each challenge, the different stakeholders have their own perspectives on what actions should be prioritized and how. And I'm sure in ECDAN, this is a common problem because you're asking people with very different professional expertise and lived experience to come together and work for early childhood development. But they have their own perspectives, their own understanding of what to prioritize. And everybody wants to be heard and engaged. You can't shut some people out and just listen to a few. That creates terrible tensions and difficulties. Since 2018, when I left the UN, I started an organization called 4SD, which Shekufe introduced early on. And we've been accompanying people all over the world who are responsible for sustainable development. And they've been using quite structured systems dialogues to bring in increasing numbers of stakeholders and to involve them in working in alignment with the SDGs. We've used dialogue as a way of enabling very different stakeholders to contribute when establishing direction for the path ahead and navigating ways forward in response to specific challenges. Now, I want to stress that the kind of way in which we've structured the dialogues reflects our understanding of how best to get very, very different perspectives brought to the table, and in particular, including people who are usually not there, people who are perhaps left behind or hard to reach. We found that dialogues are really useful when establishing the direction for working together. We found they're useful for bringing in voices that are normally not heard. We found they're terribly useful for getting people with very different professional or personal views to work together. We've seen dialogues used to review progress and also dialogues being incorporated into the wider public discourse. Quite simply, we've become totally convinced that dialogues are essential when you're working with complex challenges and systems approaches. Actually, dialogues have been used for centuries in lots of different communities as a way of enabling very different perspectives to be voiced. It enables people to deepen their appreciation of how others see things. A dialogue helps you to consider different opinions, but also, when you've got disagreement, to find agreement if you possibly can. And we've also seen how dialogues can be helpful as a space for debate, as an opportunity for collaboration, of a way of building consensus and sharing commitments. So our 4SD Foundation has now, over the last 5 years, developed what it calls a method of systems dialogues. It's a standardized method for convening the people who are going to take part in a dialogue, for curating the dialogue process with a master of ceremonies, somebody like John, who's good at bringing everybody together, and then for facilitating the discussion between those who take part. And in fact, we differentiate the roles of the convener, the curator, and the facilitator in our work. And we've been developing the method since 2018, and we think it works really well. We used it for the Food Systems Summit in 2021, but we've used it in lots of other settings, including the follow-up to that summit, even to this day. Our method enables a number of different processes to occur. We like to have clear and consistent guidelines. We like people to know the processes that are useful. We like to find ways to reduce barriers so that when a dialogue happens, people feel that it's open and they're not going to be embarrassed or hurt or shown up on social media. We love dialogues as a way of widening participation, bringing in people, as I say, who are normally not there. Often women and children don't participate. Often even farmers, we found, don't participate in dialogues about food. And we found that it's so important to have patience, particularly those on low incomes, when we're talking about diseases and health challenges. And so our method is there to streamline dialogue efforts, to eliminate the time and resources needed to plan, because there's something for you to look at and test and see whether it works in your situation. And we have therefore also developed targeted training programs for facilitators and more meaningful conversations and better outcomes. And our method also helps with monitoring, evaluation, and syntheses of dialogue outcomes. So I've just got a few elements of our method that I really would like you to have in your minds and in your hearts. First of all, 4 of the key questions that we think are really quite important. Be clear, we say, on the purpose of your dialogue. Are you trying to bring in voices that haven't been heard? Are you trying to look at ways of getting a more inclusive program that responds to people's needs? Well, be clear. And then when you're having the dialogue, focus on where things ought to be in the future rather than what's wrong now. And we've used 2030 as the date that we often identify for the future state when we're thinking through what needs to happen. So here's an example of a future state. Everybody in our community can access the nutritious food that they need for children and women to be healthy and have the best chance in life. And that food is produced sustainably with farmers earning a decent income. That's a future state statement about access to nutrition, food produced sustainably, and farmer income. Now, you might choose in your dialogue to reduce the number of elements in that future state. That's your choice. But you need to have a future state statement, if you possibly can, with a year on it, if you possibly can, because that makes the dialogue more meaningful. Now, having got your overarching future state, then, as I say, you can have discussion topics that perhaps look at different parts of it. So one discussion topic could be enabling all people to access the nutrition they need by 2030. Another could be enabling all food to produce sustainably by 2030. Or another might be enabling all farmers to have a decent income by 2030. What we've done in our dialogue, as you'll see in a minute, is always make sure that you never have more than about 10 people sitting around a table in a discussion, and you give them long enough so that they can get properly into the discussion, about 90 minutes, not longer. And we try to make sure that the discussion topics are clear enough for everybody to understand. And then at the table, we try to be clear that there should be a diversity of people around the table, people who farm, people who process and retail food, but people also who consume, people who are nutritionists and determined to get the right food being eaten, people involved in environmental health and hygiene may also need to be there. You might have business people there. You might have representatives from different NGOs, but you just try to make sure that there is a diversity around the table and there is a facilitator who can make it happen. Now, we've also in our dialogue method been very clear that when you're doing the dialogue, it needs to have different parts clearly set out. Let me just give you my tips. I have been a dialogue curator for about 100 different dialogues on food, on nutrition, on health, and on crisis. The most important thing that I've found as the curator, the person who holds it all together, is I want to keep the speeches at the beginning to an absolute minimum. How often have I been to meetings where the curator says, we're going to have a dialogue and everybody's going to have a chance to talk. And then we have 5 speeches by VIPs who have to be there, who come along and read prepared statements. And before we've had 15 or 20 minutes, I look around the room and everybody is on their cell phones or on their computers or looking out the window because they're having to listen to boring statements. And I'm saying, stop that. Let's try to get people into the discussions at the discussion tables as quickly as possible. So the opener, which ideally is from the curator, is about explaining to people what they're being asked to do, explaining to them what the ideal future state is, explaining to them what the discussion topics are, explaining to them who the facilitators are, explaining the principles of the dialogue, but then quickly getting them to their tables where they do the discussion with around 10 people per table, then quickly getting the discussion going. It's magic. Once the tables start working and everybody can get talking to each other, you don't need to muck around giving them lots of advanced instructions. You want the facilitators to get them going, to go around the 10, 12 people at the discussion table, get them to introduce themselves quickly, to be clear on the discussion topic. And the facilitator's job is needed there to make sure that every voice is heard, and that if there are contentious issues, the facilitator holds them at the table. John's words are so important. Hold the tension there so that people don't split up and have a big bust up. I've been at dialogues once or twice where there are bust ups because people really don't want to sit together. And that does require a bit of refereeing, using the football technique. Sometimes you have to use a yellow card when somebody is really not being respectful. And just occasionally you have to use a red card and invite them to slip out away from the table if they've been terribly rude or intolerant, because that really destroys the dialogue. I try to say that a discussion at a discussion table should be no more than 90 minutes. As I say, too much longer, people need to go off for comfort. But if you're much shorter, if you have dialogue, say, for half an hour, people are only just getting into the issue. You want to be sure that you've got enough time for the discussants to be able to look at the question, look at the topic and consider how are we going to reach the ideal state? What are we going to prioritize? And then if the facilitator has been trained in this way, you can look at, as well as the priorities, who should be involved, what's the timetable. It starts to buzz. And typically I have 60 to 80 people in one of these dialogues. So that's around 10 or 12 tables of maximum of 10 tables of about 10 people each if you're going up to 100. But you want to try to keep the tables small. Don't let people make the tables too full. Otherwise, not everybody gets a chance to speak. After about 90 minutes, I really want everybody to have a break. If they are able to have a cup of coffee, that's the time. And then I bring them back. I don't want them being away for too long. I want the energy to be back in the room. They go back into their tables, and I ask each facilitator, either themselves or through a nominee, to give some kind of report back of the group discussion. But I don't ask them to say exactly what happened. That can get terribly boring. How often have we been at sessions where the facilitators or somebody else just goes through a list and you think, why am I having to listen to all this? No, I ask the facilitators to say, what did you feel at your table? They love it. And then sometimes I invite others to say, well, what did you all feel at your table? And the discussion starts to buzz. And sometimes you get buzzing discussion between facilitators from the different tables because it gets to be quite fun. And so I ask them to talk about their feelings at the table, usually for no more than 4 minutes. And then as we go from one facilitator to the next, and let's hope we haven't got too many tables. Let's say we've got 6. And we've got 6 facilitators sharing what they've found. I'm sitting there with my notebook and usually a colored pen, and I'm identifying ideas that seem to be recurring from one table to the next. And I usually try to find about 5 of them. And then what I do is synthesize the feeling that's coming through from all the tables. And then I act like a mirror and I give it back to the whole group and I invite people to comment on it. And that's when I bring in some of the VIPs that are frustrated because they didn't get to speak at the beginning of the whole program. And I invite them to comment at the end. And it's much more fun. So that's a typical dialogue. About 15 minutes, if I'm lucky, for the beginning, about 90 minutes for the discussion group, 15, 20 minutes for a break, 60 minutes plus or minus for the end bit, wrap it all up together. It's about 3 hours. And that, for me, is a dialogue event. And if it's successful, here's the words at the bottom. You want to have open and honest discussion. You want to have diverse perspectives coming out in the open. You want some new ideas to be floating, different ways of working. And I told you I've done quite a lot of these, and it's a privilege because each time, although I feel exhausted after the 3 hours, I feel invigorated because the energy that's unleashed when people get a chance to talk together, this energy that John has introduced me to and has invited me to really appreciate, this energy is great. And if that energy is accompanied by dissonance, people disagreeing, it gets even better. And if the facilitators have been clever enough to be able to hold that in the group, then you get that whole balance idea. And as we go through the different tables in the dialogue, you get amplification and the process starts to get a build-up of energy. And if you can have a dialogue, perhaps repeated month after month with the same basic group of people, the amplification is intense. And this is what we did on an immensely large scale for the Food Systems Summit. 159 countries, a lot of independent dialogues, totaling 1,650 dialogue moments, 110,000 participants, producing through succession of dialogues 127 national pathways to food systems of the future that have been kept alive over the past 2 years and are still being referred to. Even recently, when I traveled and met with 75 national food systems transformation conveners and saw just how amazing this process has been as a stimulus to food systems transformation. It's not perfect. There are always difficulties, but at least it keeps you focused on the reality of what's happening at country level. Is there a theory behind all this, you might be asking? It'd be jolly useful if there is, because if we're going to introduce dialogues into our own programs, we need to be able to refer to something. And there is. There's an amazing person called Cantor, Kantor, who identified what he calls the 4-player model in dialogue. John introduced this to me. In a way, I'm almost trying to goad him into jumping in and commenting on it. And he will, I know, he doesn't hold back.
I can do that if you want, David.
Yeah, come in, John.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that happens behind a dialogue that really makes it work. And it's why David was saying he places so much emphasis on the time, how long it takes to actually make things happen. Because when you put a group of people who are a little bit unsure of themselves, maybe, or maybe one or two of them a little feeling hierarchical, that they're the boss and they run this, and you put them all together and give them a discussion topic, the first thing that we'd see happening is in that bottom left corner where you've got separate circles. We call it hiding. And what's happening there is people are just making statements. There's no connection between them. It's just they're saying what they always say. Well, I think this is important because, well, our policy on this is, my life's work tells me that. There's nothing building off anybody else. And they're really hiding from the openness that's necessary to really create a breakthrough. The next thing that happens, if you leave that long enough, is David will say something and I'll say, well, David, in my experience, as if I'm playing to some higher level. That's not quite how it turns out. And me and David start to have a little bit of a fight about this, either very politely or sometimes less so. And the rest of the discussion group just tends to sit and watch on and go, okay, let's see how this plays out. But if you're a skilled group, or if you've got a skilled facilitator, they might say, well, David, we've heard from you. We've heard from you, John. Elizabeth, what are you thinking when you hear these two together? Then you start to introduce something that breaks the back and forth. And that's the playing bit. We're just toying with, well, what might we do here? And then suddenly everybody's in the conversation and it's hugely creative and we're firing off each other and everything's bursting. And that's the amplification point. That's the energy point. That's where that dissonance between David and I has sparked something that's taken off further. And that's that moment of flow. And that's what you're aiming for. And usually it takes a bit of time to get there. And it's quite brittle. You know, you get to these points, David, don't you, in dialogues where suddenly it's going brilliantly and then somebody comes in from a different angle and the whole thing
Especially if they
and you
are
have to go around again.
trying to dominate. It's and that's why facilitation is so absolutely critical. If you've got one world expert at a table, and they occasionally want to make sure that everybody else knows that they're a world expert. They're usually people my kind of age and appearance. And that's why we need facilitators who've been told that it's okay to stop anybody being dominant, because the whole purpose of dialogue is to enable everybody to get their time to speak. Isn't that right, John?
Absolutely. And it's we've heard what the big voices say over and over and over again.
Yeah.
That's running the red line harder in my language. It's the other voices that come in that are absolutely critical to making the move. And the real skill is making space for that and making it safe for people to feel that they can say their bit, because it matters probably more than the the big inputs that we tend to get from the
And that's why we are very careful, no taking of pictures for social media actually during a dialogue without checking with everybody, and no attribution of any comment to anybody. Don't say that the farmer who's called Joe over our dialogue table complained about the low price he's getting from the supermarkets for his produce. Unless he says, I'm okay, I want to be saying that, that's something that I want to be quoted on. But often they don't, because the power relations is difficult. And this now takes me into, it is the fourth part of John and my joint presentation. On my timesheet, we have about 11 minutes. And this is a little bit of revision. And it's John and me sharing with you our summary points of what it takes to be a leader for living systems. And I know that in the way this is designed as the kind of climax of your work, and some of this you will probably not all agree with, but let's at least share with you our perspective. Firstly, 3 areas where we believe that a systems leader needs to strive to be confident. And he needs to be, the systems leader, she or he, needs to be confident in these areas, because we ask the systems leader to be comfortable even in very complex situations. None of these is easy. First, be comfortable and confident when working in the political arena. That means being confident with working with those who seek to accumulate and then use power. It doesn't mean that you have to be political, but you need to be comfortable working with those who are being political, because they are always going to be important participants. Second, you may, when you're a systems leader, be trying to take people into new and unwanted directions. Here you are in ECDAN, trying to invite pediatricians, social workers, government officials, businesses to prioritize the interests and the well-being of the newborn child. But that means you're asking them to focus sometimes on people, particularly very young children, with whom they perhaps don't spend a lot of time. They don't think a lot about them. And so your role as a systems leader for the early child may well be kind of encouraging people to be a little bit frustrated. What are you doing bringing that to me again? Why are you raising this issue? And you might actually be under attack. But please work hard to avoid seeing this as being about you. You're not responsible for the fact that newborn children and the early child is often not featuring strongly in policy or in labour practices. Don't feel it's your responsibility. You are the agent, and we ask you to be able to cope with the adversity without bringing it on yourself. And lastly, third area of confidence is uncertainty. I've had this so much. You know, when I was working on COVID 2020 through to 2022 full-time with John and others, we really were having to cope with the fact that this is a new virus, and we didn't know what kind of surprises it had in store for us. So we had to be able to deal with uncertainty, whether we were doing media work or giving presentations. How did we do it? And then, because we were so unsure of what COVID represented, we also didn't quite know whether we were being successful. I was part of a team of envoys and then part of a team of technicians. And we were all saying, what is success, given We just haven't got an idea how this pandemic is going to evolve. And sometimes we're finding that in some places, health systems were really breaking down because of COVID. And new ideas were only emerging quite slowly. How did we know whether we were doing something useful in helping governments to find their way forward? Uncertainty was always there. My response was always to say, I don't know. And by extension, probably you don't know. But I was careful not to say, we don't know, i.e. the body of scientists doesn't know, because that's when we get quite a lot of anger, particularly from people who thought that we were sort of misleading them, the people who really didn't like what we were doing. I found always bringing it to myself helped a lot when it was talking about uncertainty. So 3 areas of confidence: politics, adversity, uncertainty. One point that just simply builds on what John said: be ready at all times when you're working on systems for things changing in a non-linear way. John just showed us, do you remember that red line was going along in a nice straight line, but the blue line was increasing in gradient quite quickly. That was an exponential acceleration. Dealing with exponential issues that change rapidly is very difficult, but in living systems, it's common that you find it, because decision makers always tend to act in a linear way. They're not always ready for the big leaps that John just described, especially because you frequently in systems work have breakdown and collapse occurring at the same time as you've got exponential acceleration. Just the tip is, hold it. Don't dismiss it. Hold it in your arms, in your heart. Stay a little bit away from it in terms of trying not to get totally overwhelmed by it. And that's hard. And remember to look after yourself so you don't get ground down by these processes. And the leader always has to be able to cope with different perspectives and be ready to find ways to connect with others. So when you're trying to do that big leap to get onto that exponential, we had to do it, for example, in 2021, when we started to get COVID vaccines coming on board. It required a big leap to get everybody working for vaccines. And it was very difficult because not everybody basically adopted the same approach. So leaping together is not the easiest job when you're dealing with a messy situation. And so that led us to identifying 3 important capacities or capabilities for living systems leaders. One is always looking around and scoping and saying, what's going on? What's going on between here and the horizon? What are different people thinking? Can I make a sense of meaningful direction that I can get everybody to come into by doing scoping? The systems leader has to be able to offer direction, because in practice, we're often taking one step at a time, but we need the direction in mind. And on work that I did as the Secretary General Special Envoy on Ebola, my job was not to set up new fancy mechanisms for tackling it. My job was to help people find a meaningful direction for doing that. Secondly, my job was to help ensure that we evolve progressively with our response to Ebola virus disease in 2014 and 2015, allowing the plans for what we were going to do around burials, around quarantine, around behavior change, around hospital beds, to evolve progressively and to emerge as the work progressed. And that notion that the work is always evolving is something key for a systems leader. You never get it right at the beginning. And, you know, you also have to be constantly on the lookout for opportunities. The strategy matters, but you take things forward and you do the leaps through opportunities. I mean, we've all noticed that you're trying to advance a difficult issue. For example, you're trying to work on early childhood development. Suddenly, you've got a new government official arrives who perhaps has got a newborn baby at home, and this government official is really excited and interested, and you get an opportunity to talk about early childhood development because this government official is full of excitement about newborn daughter and is saying, let's just learn from what we've got at home. And you can say, yes, I've got an opportunity. And you pursue that strategy through opportunity. And sometimes you adapt that strategy through opportunity. So there's two fancy words that we've got here. One is strategy and opportunity, which is to stropping. And then the other is adapting your strategy, which is adaptogy. And I got adaptogy from John, and it's a word that I love. It's one of his things that he's given me. And so then I moved to perhaps the final point that I wanted to share with you. What do I look for when I'm trying to interview people and work out, are they going to be able to deal with complex issues using living systems approaches? John and I worked on these, I think, pretty much together, that as always with us, it was he who crystallized them. I'm tempted to ask him to finish off, but I'm also aware that we're tight on time. So I will just go through these very fast and invite him to say the last words. First of all, if you're a living systems leader, you have to be able to hold competing perspectives on any issue or issues at the same time. Basically, on any systems challenge, there are lots of different perspectives held by the different people looking at them, and none of these is wrong. That's the important thing. They're not wrong. And you have to be able to hold them at the same time and not to dismiss them. Second, you can look at a whole system of early childhood development and see it in terms of the different actors and the way they're engaged and the tensions and the challenges. But you also might want to get particularly involved in, neonatal health or infant hygiene or the nutrition of the young child. And you can focus on those detailed parts, but you need to then flip out and look at neonatal health or hygiene or nutrition in the wider context, and then go back and look at it in detail. Because once you step out to look at the interactions and you go back to the detail because you're dealing with a small part. But you have to be able to do this constant movement between the big picture and the detail, and do it with your colleagues as well. Colleagues, I'm just going to look at the whole thing for a bit. Let's pause with our detail and let's get back into just considering the whole picture, perhaps from the perspective of the mother. And then we'll go back and look at the particular nutrition questions in a minute. Making that switch from whole system to parts is key, and the leader has to be able to do that. Third, when you're looking at a system, you need to get all your senses really on full alert. Your senses of your hearing, your sight, taste, smell, feel, all matter. Smell is very important, particularly when we're together. But while you're getting your senses going, I want you to do one other thing, which is to be feeling into how the system is. In particular, what is its pace? What is its rhythm? And is it ready for a shift? When we were working on Ebola 2017 in Monrovia, working with government and community organizations, the one thing we had to constantly be feeling is whether or not people really were ready to have specific instructions given to them on the kind of quarantine that we wished them to adopt, or the way in which we wanted them to work with the treatment centers. And we had to really be sensitive, because if there was a general sense of frustration, anger, even despair, we had to be super careful not to jolt the communities with complex new instructions, particularly when it came to asking them to stay at home and not move because we were worried about disease spread. In fact, that was one of the most delicate areas of all. Fourthly, everywhere is different. You might have a health system offering really good postnatal services for women, and you want to have a set of standard methods that you're asking auxiliary nurse midwives to take and to deliver in different places. But if you've got a health centre, frankly, where there's not much water, not much electricity, very difficult for people to reach, and a fairly dispersed catchment area, you're going to need to use a very different way of working in that system compared with what happens in a health centre with good electricity, water supplies, and a dense catchment area. Your whole approach will be different. So remember, the environment, the place really matters. John introduced me to that because when a lot of his health system work, he was working on the total place being the basis for our work. Or in ECDAN, it's the place where the child is that really matters. And we've always said that that matters more than anything else. And lastly, how often have you been with a boss and the boss is going to go and give a talk to the staff? And as the boss is walking in, the boss says to you, how are they? And you can say, well, they're a bit nervous about the changes you're going to put in. And the boss might say, oh, okay, I get it. I'll try to listen to them first and then adapt what I say to where they are. And that's great. And you think, oh, thank goodness. But the boss might say, I'm not feeling good today. I'm feeling a bit fed up. I think they should understand what I'm about to say. I'm going to treat them as though they do. And I'm not going to kind of take account of the fact that some of them are a bit disturbed, because really they've had long enough and they should meet me where I am. And you think, oh my goodness, this is going to be a tough one. And that's what we both feel, that in this kind of work, whatever you do, meet people right where they really are. These are 5 qualities that we identified. They're in this little note that's referenced at the bottom here. But we encourage you to think yourselves. There are lots more qualities that you need if you're a systems leader working with living systems. What can we find that's useful in our place? Thank you very much indeed. I go back to John because it's closure time for us and over to Elizabeth. I just want to give the chance to basically say if I got anything wrong.
Oh, David, as if, you know, all really, really helpful. I think my closing comment on it would be, so the act of systems leadership is an act of not thinking, what can I do here, but what could this system really do? And how might I liberate that capacity within it? It's an act of liberation, not an act of control. And those of us who are privileged enough to enjoy some freedoms perhaps sometimes forget that freedom can take quite a lot of work to get and to maintain, and that the Systems Leadership Act is about liberating people to really be as good as they can be all the way across the system, so that we achieve that exponential shift that we're hoping for, that would make such a difference to the lives of little kids wherever they are. Thank you. Elizabeth, to you.
Oh my goodness. David, John, how inspiring you have been this morning, and how you have given us hope that in the face of complexity, we can actually make the systems changes that are required. David, I have watched you in many UN meetings at the World Bank as we try to set up the Scaling Up Nutrition partnership. And you have been a great role model for many of us working in global health and many other issues. I have watched you walk the talk of what you have just presented to us. And the work that both of you also have done recently with the COVID-19 is truly inspiring and amazing. And I think it gives the ECD community that, yes, we have enormous complexity because we are multi-sectoral. We're not just fixing one system, we're fixing so many systems. And therefore, how does it all come together? It can sometimes be overwhelming just thinking about it. How do you get education, health, nutrition, social protection, child protection to come together? Because as we say in early childhood development, it takes a village to raise and care for a child. It takes so many stakeholders. So the dialogue across all these stakeholders, across sectors, and what you've just described is so critical to making sure that children thrive. I think what we have also learned that with the increasing complexity, the polycrisis that is facing young children, the traditional ways of doing business or traditional leadership styles are not going to help us move forward. We have to be audacious, I think, and as John says, we have to step up above the threshold and adapt. And shifting from the traditional leadership that is hierarchical, linear, and control-based to leaders who can embrace that uncertainty, ambiguity, and create opportunities for conditions, to establish conditions for collective creativity and collaborative action. Now, in my work, I have learned that getting people to collaborate is not easy, as many of you have in the work that you do. Persuading through influence, to have people give up their autonomy, to have people leave their logos behind, to take credit or care who takes credit and want to be at the front. We know that all that does not work. So therefore, creating the dialogues, the conditions that enable for people to co-create, to create together and move forward around a shared goal, not worried about how they'll get there, but figuring out as they go along. I think the emergence that David mentioned and evolving as you go along. And shifting, I think, from being reactive to being creative, I think is what we all need to do when we're dealing with complexity. So recently, as we embarked on developing our 5-year strategy, we held several consultations. And with that, I think it emerged that the ECD field has neglected system leadership as a lever for the system change that we need. We've not really invested in this as much as we should, as we've learned from the food system and other areas. We've also, I think, acknowledged that ECD has complex work cultures and issues in different settings, and how we define quality and other things, and also depending on the politics, but also the power play within the movement itself. We also recognize we have limited resources to support leadership development, and we have been very slow in providing opportunities for professional and leadership training, especially for young leaders, providing them mentoring, coaching opportunities, and so on. And until we have this distributed leadership of skilled leaders who are able to navigate through this complexity, we will not achieve the systems change. And we're not, we have many leaders within the early childhood development movement. But we are short of unifying leaders, or those institutions that are willing to walk the talk across the sectors and put individual ambitions or institutional interests behind. So then my question to you both, David and John, how do we use the lessons that you have gained from the work you've done for us to kind of start to deal with some of these challenges in the ECD field. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to dive in because this is how it tends to work with David and I, is I tend to give you a quick response, by which time David has thought of something more measured that adds the sort of wisdom at the end of it. So for me, the stuff that we're talking about is actually very practical. There's a fair number of questions in the Q&A about, well, how do I learn this stuff? How do I do it? A lot of this is about being very human, by which I mean acknowledging the stuff that you don't know, by which I mean being an example to those around you. People learn most of their leadership, this element about building resource, building capability. People learn most of their leadership not on courses or on programs, but in the experiences that they have. How does their boss behave? What does she do? What does he do? How did they deal with that circumstance? Or but by just trying stuff. So my view is, don't over mystify it, but be it. Try as hard as you can to do the things that you need to do. The thing with resource, and there's never enough resource. But for me, there's always a lot more resource than people realize. It's just perhaps not in the most helpful places. So I've spent a lot of time doing really quite big transformation with very little resource, because sometimes if you have a lot of resource, it all becomes about how you manage what you've got, rather than how will I engage others in the thing that I feel is important. And then the last thing about it all is, we can get really excited sometimes by process and about management and about how do we do things. Never ever lose sight of what we're here for, and keep putting it on the table in front of everybody, because that's the unifying thing. That's the thing that will encourage people to move. And it's how do you build that bigger space that enables everyone else to step into it? That means that they feel okay to share some of what they're doing. They feel okay to try to do the things that you do. And that they do that because the reason why we're here is shared and common, and we're passionate about it. David, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you're right. While you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, he's done it. So you remember that one of the slides I had just introduced 4 questions that we think are kind of quite important. What's the future state that we want? What are the topics we need to look at when considering how to reach that future state? And then who should be there to exchange and talk about it? Honestly, in my view, Elizabeth, those are the core questions to hold in all the time when you are thinking of advancing and trying to test out whether a system is ready to change. And so I would say, basically, give it a try in any situation without spending too much time preparing. Just go through those basic questions all the time, trying to widen the circles of engagement so you get more people coming, perhaps with a succession of dialogues. In the questions, I noticed one person said, the trouble is the people you really need to be there, the decision makers, often don't turn up. So it's the juniors who do the talking, but the bosses still keep control. So that's why I like to encourage a constant and continuous process of dialoguing. Over time, the decision makers will want to come along. They may try to control, but at least you get them there. And that's my last point. Try at all times to say our dialogue spaces are welcoming spaces. They're not pushing people away, because as John said just now, if you make it welcoming, then it's easier to get more people there. To help us do it, we think that training is useful. Train the people who are going to be convening or organizing dialogues. That might be your ECTAN representatives in different countries. Train the people who will be the curators, the masters of ceremony. They are absolutely vital, but they need to be people who don't simply use tricks to try to make some of the people who are there feel a bit unwanted. They've got to do welcoming language, and they've got to be really genuine people who enjoy bringing lots of people together. And then most importantly, your facilitators for the individual dialogue tables, you need to teach them as well. So some generic teaching wouldn't be a bad idea as well.
No, thank you, David. And within the audience, we have actually a former minister from Bulgaria, Ivanka, who's also just put in a comment. And walking the talk of listening to each other, could we ask you to actually share your comment with the rest of the audience? It's a very important one. Thank you, Ivanka. I think you're on mute. There you go.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, yes. You have lived the experience, so let's hear from you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. First of all, I would like to say that all the facts that were shared by the presenters made me really reflect on my recent role as a system leader, so to say, because I was in charge of all the social perspectives and policies, including early childhood development. And you made me think about what we can do better as a community globally in terms of building this leadership base, because it is true that ECD is not a policy domain which is highly recognized as the trigger for sustainable development of societies. And I'm saying this coming from an EU member state where a lot of policy leaders are thinking about economic growth and development, workforce and employment strategies, but they do not consider the fact that actually to build competent workforce, you need early childhood development policies and practices. And my comment in the chat was that I think there are leaders globally, but there is little space for us to reflect on our experience as leaders, being leaders of community in the ECD arena, being leaders of networks, or even leaders like myself in the government, because I believe that there is already some knowledge globally about leadership. Of course, what the two presenters gave us today was amazing experience and perspective, but I think we can also learn from our own experience. How do we mainstream ECD in non-functioning, usually very authoritarian systems, which we want to change so that they can be inclusive, empowering, and unleashing the potential and creativity of people? So my comment was that if we can find such spaces and such opportunities for leaders in the ECD arena to share their failures, but their successes too in improving systems in the ECD arena, I personally think it wouldn't cost a lot of money, but I think that would build on this community of leaders with experience who can maybe empower the new generation in the topic, and maybe that can change the status quo and put ECD on a higher level of recognition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivanka. Very important points there. Foster reflective learning. And I think generative conversations is also very important. Thank you so much. I think I saw somebody else put up their hand. Asma? Can we unmute Asma? And please introduce yourself. We can't hear you.
So while we're waiting for that, Elizabeth, I'm wondering, there's a really good question in the chat about how do you practically work with power dynamics within these dialogues? For example, working in the UN system is incredibly hierarchical, and different positions within that hierarchy greatly hamper people's willingness to contribute and perceive legitimacy of what people have to contribute.
And then I think in addition, there was a question on how do you deal with dissonance? So perhaps we can take those two together.
I'm happy to jump in on either of those, David. If you want a particular one, you say. I will start with the dissonance. And it goes back to, so what's the bigger thing that holds us all together? It's fine to differ, so long as we are, we're not disagreeable. And that requires the bigger piece that says, well, what is it that we actually hold in common? And often you have to go up a level of detail or 2 levels of detail to find that. What's the story we would both tell? I think be curious about what makes people differ. Why is somebody intelligent? I presume in every dialogue that I'm in that everybody in it is just as experienced as me, probably more so, just as clever, just as worldly wise. Why do they see it differently to me? How can I be curious about what they're thinking rather than my instinctive reaction? Elizabeth, you said that move from reactive to creative, just making that pause and instead of me reacting to the dissonance but to say, well, what's the creative potential here? I think don't be scared of it. It's something we're often we as leaders, we try and smooth it out. So we all agree that you hear a leader say, and no, we don't usually. We usually have some difference. And so, okay, name it. These are some things that we're going to have to work on. I would say, think of it like a cooking pot. Keep taking the temperature. Too high, it bubbles over. Too low, nothing much is happening. So keep talking to people, keep sensing into the room, keep looking around, keep using all your senses to figure out, is this going at the right rate or is it not? And then the last thing is, not everybody has to do everything. We can disagree, and some groups can do one thing and some groups can do another that's heading in the same way. And often the tension comes where people feel they have to give something up in order to join. And the answer is, well, it's your choice. This is what this group is going to do. You can choose to join it if it's helpful, and if it's not, that's okay. So those are some things that I do with dissonance. I could go on to hierarchy, David, but I'm going to let your voice come.
So, first of all, Dr. Ivanka from southern Bulgaria, what a lovely intervention from you. Thank you very much indeed for asking us just how does this come into place. And then to Elizabeth, I want to be really clear that the only way we can take this forward is by making dialoguing the thing to do rather than the thing to avoid. Why do we have so many panels where you've got 5 people supposedly talking for 5 minutes each? They all go over time. They don't really focus on what it is they're communicating in terms of the receiver. They just focus on what they're saying. And we know how incredibly lifeless those discussions can be. So the way through this is by actually being clear, and I think Ekdan can help with this, that there's a different way of working that is the way of working when we want to put the interests of the early child at the center of what we're doing. And that means focusing on the early child, not focusing on our organizations, institutions, political parties or whatever, but it's the early child and the immediate environment of that early child that really matters. And then we have to be clear, last point, that the people who use their power to try to stifle conversation are usually the ones who are not confident. They're the ones who need help, not the participants who are putting up with this stuff, but the people who are essentially using power as a shield or as an excuse. It's very hard because if you confront them, they can get really quite nasty, but at least hold it inside your own heart that that behavior is behavior that reflects their problem, not your problem. And we work away at it. And this is why I'm so excited about it, Dan, because this is the way of working that it has to be done for the sake of generations that are young now and going up, but also generations that are still to come.
Thank you so much, David and John. And I'm mindful of the time. We're actually
We're
on
at
time.
the end of the session.
Yes, but just
so
one last comment. I think what this masterclass series on applying systems thinking to early childhood development teaches us and helps us, we have to remain true to it is about the child, it is about the parents, it's about the community. How do we engage them in the work that we're doing to shape the systems that they want to build? And how do we continue these dialogues working with everybody, and in particular with the communities that know what works best for them? So thank you so much, David and John and all the participants. And now I hand over to Shekufe, who will tell us how we're going to take this work forward. Over to you, Shekufe.
Well, I mean, yeah, I will do my best, but I'm very mindful of time. So we will wrap up really quickly. We won't have time for everything. But before beginning, I just wanted to say congratulations, everyone. We have finished the Masterclass series, and this is incredible. I'm just amazed that so many of you have been here for all the sessions. So big congratulations to everyone. I hope it's been rich, and we would really like to hear from you. Please, in the next minute or so, as I wrap up, I want you to write in the chat, what are some ideas of how we can expand, deepen, this systemic way of working across the early childhood world? We'd love to hear from you. I just want to take a minute to really thank, so can the EGNAN team who's online just put themselves on video? They've been working so hard behind the scenes. Shreya, Hannah, Catherine, Carol, Hamid, really big thanks to each and every one of you for all the effort. As I've mentioned before, our systems thinking work has these different pillars. I won't go into everything, but we started off by doing research. We did a systematic review of over 40,000 articles to really see what the impact of the systems work is. Published a commentary in the BMJ to really uncover why we want to do this. What we learned from all of that is that, well, you can't really do RCTs on systems work, and our gold standard for evidence versus what we want to do systemically. I mean, that's why we're doing this masterclass series, so we can bring all these different measurement perspectives. And then we also realized, in order to support and sustain this work, we need to have funders, we need to have an environment, an ecosystem that takes a systemic approach to investing. So not just investing in systems projects, little projects, but actually take a more systemic approach. That's why we've had philanthropies be a part of this series to share how they do that. The systems measurement work will be launching a repository of all of these different frameworks and tools, so stay tuned for that so you can easily access that. We've had a knowledge fellow working on that over the last 9 months. And then we've also been taking deep dives into thematic areas. We were in Bangladesh, where we did an ecosystem, looking at the humanitarian early childhood system, and we will be launching a case study soon in a humanitarian webinar. We were in Tashkent at the World Education, Early Childhood Care and Education conference, where we had ministers from Ghana and Tajikistan and the former minister from Australia with us, talking about taking a more systems approach to early childhood. We've had a systems working group with major organizations from around 5 countries in the world working to develop a childcare systems map. So we've been trying to explore all of these work. And in the future, what we would really, our dream would be, is to see, can we have country systems learning hubs? Because we know that systems work is so important, and where we can have all of these, whatever we talked about, the mapping, the dialogues, all of that embedded at the country level with stakeholders and partners there. So some of the things we've been thinking about, and we'd love to hear your thought on it, is efforts to build the executive systems leadership, so finding those ecosystem leaders, really supporting them, building up their systemic leadership capacity. A few of them have demanded capabilities for their organization, so looking into courses that we're, and experiences that we can facilitate for organizational development. And then to accompany these stakeholders into as they facilitate ecosystem engagement on early childhood, to see if we can start to nudge these systemic transformations and take these efforts, and of course have cross-country and regional learning exchange and documentation of this work, so we start to build the field and build the momentum and movement. So we're just getting started, but really in the chat, and if you want to raise your hands, I know we're at time, I'm 5 minutes over, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but we would love to hear from you whether these sound like ideas you're interested in. If you have other ideas, let us know. But John and David, I know we're at time, so you're more than welcome to drop off. So I don't want to keep you any longer, but thank you so much, everyone. But yes, we'd love to hear from anyone who wants to share ideas of how they would like to see this work move forward. But sounds interesting and excited, much needed initiatives. Okay, well, thanks for the feedback in the chat. All right, with that, we officially close the masterclass series. Thank you so much to everyone. Catherine will share in the chat how the certification process will work. And looking forward to future engagement and systems thinking. Thanks, everyone.
Congratulations to the team.